The traveler took the seat of honor, his back to the canvas curtain. Across the table the young woman smiled and kept talking. 6 inches behind his skull, a hammer lifted. He had stopped here for the same reason everyone stopped here. On this road, there was nowhere else. The road was the Great Osage Trail, and in the early 1870s, it was the only open route west through the raw southeast corner of Kansas. The Osage people had just been forced south into what would become Oklahoma, and their land was thrown open to homesteaders, so settlers poured in from Germany and the eastern states chasing free acreage. But the country was still barely governed, thin on towns and thinner on law, and a traveler crossing it might go a full day without seeing a roof. About 7 miles northeast of a brand new town called Cherryvale, a family had claimed 160 acres right against the trail and built a small cabin that doubled as a store and an inn. To a tired, hungry rider, it was the most welcome thing on the prairie. A hot meal, a hard bed, a place to stop. They were called the Benders, and on paper they were a family of 4. John Bender the elder was around 60, and the little English he spoke came out low and guttural, so neighbors could rarely understand him. His wife Elvira was in her 50s, sharp and cold enough that people who met her called her a she-devil. Then there were the 2 younger ones. John Jr. was about 25, auburn-haired and handsome, but he had a habit of laughing at nothing, and the neighbors quietly decided he was simple. And there was Kate. Kate was around 23, bright and striking, and completely at ease with strangers, which none of the others were. She read fortunes. She held seances. She printed handbills advertising herself as a healer who could cure the sick and speak to the dead, and she gave public lectures that scandalized and fascinated the county in equal measure. People came from miles around just to see her. That was the point. Because the front room of that cabin was a trap, and Kate was the bait. The inside was split by that single canvas wagon cover. The back half was where the family lived. The front half held the store shelves, the kitchen, and a dining table pushed up close against the cloth. When a guest came in for a meal, he was steered to the seat of honor, the chair with its back to the curtain. Kate would sit across from him and talk, and she was very good at talking. She held the guest's eyes and his attention while, 6 inches behind his skull, one of the Bender men waited on the other side of the canvas with a hammer. The blow came down on the back of the head. Then one of the women drew a knife across the throat to be certain, and beneath that chair, under the table, was a trapdoor. The body dropped into a stone-lined cellar. There it was stripped of money, of anything worth selling, and later carried out after dark and buried in the apple orchard behind the house. The horses and wagons and saddles were quietly sold. The Benders sold stolen tack and clothing openly in their own store, explaining that guests who couldn't pay their bill had simply left goods behind. It was tidy. It was profitable. And on a road where people vanished all the time, it was nearly invisible. Nearly, because not everyone sat in the chair. A man named William Pickering stopped for a meal and refused to take the seat by the canvas because the cloth was stained and it unsettled him. Kate turned on him, snatched up a knife, and he bolted out the door and rode off. A woman named Mrs. Fitz felt something move behind the curtain while she ate, heard Kate give a low command, and fled before she understood why. 2 men who came specifically to see Kate's psychic gifts sat down to dinner, and then declined to eat by the cloth, taking their plates to the store counter instead. Kate's warmth curdled instantly. The Bender men stepped out from behind the curtain, and the 2 guests felt the room change and made excuses and left. Every one of them walked away with a story they couldn't quite explain, and every one of them, without knowing it, had just saved his own life. The stories drifted through the county, but they didn't add up to anything a court could use. A stained curtain, a rude host. A strange feeling. Bodies had turned up before, too. As early as May of 1871, a man was found in nearby Drum Creek with his skull crushed and his throat cut, and the next winter 2 more men were found the same way. But this was a country full of horse thieves and drifters, where vigilante committees were always dragging in the wrong man, and no one connected the corpses to the pleasant little inn with the fortune teller. Travelers kept disappearing along that stretch of trail. People began to call it a haunted road. They still didn't look at the Benders. Then, in the winter of 1872, a widower named George Longcore left Independence to start over in Iowa, carrying his baby daughter, Mary Ann, who was around 18 months old. They never arrived anywhere. And that was the mistake that finished the Benders, because Longcore had a friend who would not let it go. His name was Dr. William York, a physician and Civil War veteran from Independence. In the spring of 1873, York set out along the trail himself, stopping at homestead after homestead, asking questions about the missing father and child. He reached Fort Scott. On the 9th of March, he turned his horse toward home. He never made it. Somewhere on that road he stopped for a meal at the Bender Inn, and Dr. William York was never seen alive again. But Dr. York was not a lone drifter, and this is where everything the Benders had counted on stopped working. He had two brothers. One was a colonel in Fort Scott. The other was Alexander York, a member of the Kansas State Senate. These were not men whose questions faded into the prairie. When William failed to come home, his brothers raised a search party of some 50 men and began combing the trail, stopping at every farm, questioning everyone. And so on the 28th of March, Colonel York rode up to the Bender cabin and sat down at that very table. The Benders admitted it freely. Yes, the doctor had stopped there. He'd eaten, he'd left, and perhaps, they suggested, he'd run into trouble with the local tribes. It was a good lie because it fit what everyone already assumed. York listened, agreed it was possible, and stayed for dinner in the same room where his brother had died. For he rode away. For the moment, the Benders had looked a United States Senator's brother in the eye and gotten away with it. But the county was tightening. A woman came forward with a fresh story. Elvira Bender had threatened her with knives and driven her out of the cabin. On the 3rd of April, Colonel York came back, this time with armed men, and repeated the accusation to Elvira's face. She exploded. She screamed that the woman was a witch who had cursed her coffee, and in her fury she spoke fast, fluent English, revealing that her broken, helpless act had been exactly that, an act. It was the first crack. And as York was leaving, Kate did something strange and bold. She asked him to come back alone, on Friday night, and she would use her powers to help him find his missing brother. Come back alone to this cabin after dark. Some of York's men wanted to hang the whole family on the spot. York refused. He wanted proof. He would not get the chance to gather it. Around the same time, the whole township met at the Harmony Grove schoolhouse. 5 people packed in to deal with the wave of disappearances, and both Bender men may have sat in that room and listened as their neighbors voted to obtain a warrant and search every single homestead between the creeks. Their farm was on the list. The noose was closing, and they knew it. And then, incredibly, nobody watched them. For several days no one even noticed anything had changed. It was a cattle driver named Billy Toll who finally saw it. Passing the Bender place, he noticed the inn stood open and empty, and the animals had been left unfed, bawling in the pens. He reported it, and after a delay for bad weather, a search party rode out. Several hundred people eventually gathered. Inside, the cabin had been stripped bare of food, clothing, everything. And then someone caught the smell. It came from under a bed, from a trap door that had been nailed shut. They pried it open and dropped down into a stone-walled cellar 6 feet deep, and the floor and walls were black with dried, clotted blood. So much of it that they first assumed the bodies must be down there. They smashed the stone slab with sledgehammers. Nothing. They physically lifted the entire cabin off its foundation and moved it aside to dig underneath. Nothing. The blood had simply soaked into the earth over months and months of use. So they turned to the orchard. They drove a long metal rod into the ground, where the soil had been disturbed among the apple trees, and that evening the rod found Dr. William York, buried face down, his feet barely below the surface. By midnight they had marked 9 more suspected graves. The next morning they opened them. Body after body came out of that orchard, most with the same wounds. The back of the skull crushed and the throat cut. One man was found down the well, and in one grave they found the little girl, Mary Ann Longcore, buried with her father. She had no fatal wound on her body at all. She was still fully dressed, in her mittens and her hood. The men who dug her out believed she had been thrown into the grave alive. In the end, at least 11 bodies came out of the Bender ground, and scattered extra remains suggested there may have been many more, perhaps 20. Word raced across the country by telegraph, and within days 3,000 people had descended on the little farm, reporters coming from as far as New York and Chicago. Souvenir hunters tore the cabin apart plank by plank, carried off the bricks from the cellar, the very stones from the well. Alexander York put up a $1,000 reward, and the governor of Kansas added 2,000 more. $3,000 for 4 killers. It was an enormous sum. Nobody ever collected it. Because the Benders were already gone, detectives traced their wagon to the town of Thayer, 12 miles north, where it stood abandoned with a starving team of horses. From there the family had bought railroad tickets and split up. The 2 younger Benders rode a train south toward the Texas border and the lawless outlaw country beyond it, a place lawmen followed people into and did not come back out. The older couple went the other way, north toward Kansas City, and, it was believed, on to St. Louis. And there the trail ended. For 50 years afterward the search flickered on and off. 2 women were arrested in Michigan and tried as Mai and Kate, then let go. Every few years someone was certain they had found the Benders, and every time it came to nothing. The hammers are in a museum in Cherryvale now, and a knife with a 4-inch blade, still faintly stained, that Colonel York is said to have pulled from inside a clock on the Bender mantel. They are almost the only solid things left. The people who ran the Deadliest Inn on the American frontier, sat a senator's brother down at their killing table, looked him in the eye, and then simply stepped onto a train and disappeared into the size of the country. Years later, a girl who had lived nearby as a child remembered her father coming home from the failed hunt for them. Whenever the subject came up, she said, he would go quiet and say the same thing every time. They will never be found. And they never were,